Hello, welcome to Ideas Live. I'm Karen Anderson, and this is my co-host,
Anne-Marie Oomen, and this is the show where we interview and discuss a deep topic that we are interested in. So, what's today?
It's a really important topic, addiction. And I think it's safe to say that most all of us have had experiences with addiction, one way or another, directly, indirectly, over time. And that certainly was true in my case.
And in mine. Both our families were deeply affected by addiction.
And I'm struck by how, even though we were influenced by it, my mother was an alcoholic, our family was in complete denial about there being a problem. And if you don't acknowledge the problem, it's impossible to fix it. And so my brother and I, as adults, spoke about how we were aware that something was not okay with Mom, but we couldn't articulate what it was. And so I think that whole sense of shame and denial keeps us from getting help. Some of that has changed. How did it affect you?
Well, I think first of all, what you said first is that for many years of my childhood, we didn't even have the language for it. You know, it was that intuitive sense that something is wrong here. In my case, it was my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, which left my mother as a deeply damaged adult child of an alcoholic. And we could never figure out where some of her personality traits came from and why she was so disturbed by so many things. And it wasn't until, as an adult, not even until maybe the 80s and 90s, that I really began to get the language, the vocabulary of addiction came to the surface at that time.
Do you think she even understood the impact on her?
No, I don't. And so there was, some irreparable damage done to the family because of that, and because of not knowing. And now we know. So I think we have the language now, and now I think what we're grappling with are still some of the myths about it. Do you feel that way?
Oh, sure.
And then also, how do we actually survive and function and overcome what can be overcome?
Yeah, it was life-changing for me when it was in the 80s. I finally attended a adult child of alcoholics meeting. I mean, I didn't even know there was such a thing. And then when I started attending, it was so transformational because I met people and heard conversations about issues that I thought had been particular to me.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, it's just me who has these strange fears or anxieties or confusions, but it wasn't. And I began to connect the dots, I guess.
Yeah.
And that was hugely helpful to me. I mean, there used to be weekly meetings in Traverse City at Bethlehem Lutheran Church, and they were enormously helpful. So I think we've made some progress in terms of talking about it, but it's still an intractable issue.
And now it's not only intractable, but we have this new layer with the opioid addictions. I mean, we think of alcoholism because that's what you and I were affected by, but how many of our friends are grappling with people either in their families or their friends? The larger circle is grappling with this opioid addiction and other kinds of addictions. I mean, we forget gambling and shopping and
food,
and
electronics.
Right, some of those that are really also devastating, but don't get the front page headlines. So but I'm always curious about, how it starts, why some people and not others, what helps a family survive. Some people stay in recovery for their entire lives. Other people are cyclic in nature. And how does that work?
Well, I think it's time that we got our expert at the table.
I am so
and
glad.
Discuss some of these questions.
Yes.
So, we'll be right back.
We'll be right back.
Hello, and welcome back to Ideas Live. Today's topic is addiction, and our guest and expert is Tom Gilbert. Welcome. Tom is the founder of Touchstone Intervention, correct?
Correct.
And you've been working in this field a good long time. So
12 years, is that a good long time?
it is. It
Okay.
is.
Thank
So-
you for that work.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're so delighted to have you here. And why don't you start? We have many questions.
We have quite a long outline. I think we should start just by talking about what it is the definition of an addiction.
Sure. And there's a lot of different definitions, but one is pretty much a fairly simple one: compulsive behavior that maybe starts out pleasurable and then causes difficulty towards the end, characterized by loss of control. Answers kind of the question, I can quit, how come they can't?
Mm-hmm.
I think most simply, that would be a good working definition.
And so when you talk about behavior that starts out creating pleasure and then does harm, it's not only harm to the individual, but the circle of people around that.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So that compulsion has a ripple effect. It's not just about the individual.
It does indeed. They're not. We are not necessarily bad people trying to get good, sick people trying to get well. And during the manifestation of the disease of addiction, we on average intimately affect, and very seriously, up to 4 people, usually family members. Of course, the dysfunctional thought process of the addict is, I'm not hurting anybody but myself.
Yeah, it reminds me of how of smokers. I mean, it's been fairly recent that we've talked about secondhand smoke. I mean, for years, and I was married to a smoker. I mean, you did, it was just their thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there are very few substances which are more addictive than nicotine.
Mm-hmm.
That's so interesting because I was a smoker for many years, and I remember being offended when the culture changed and people started saying, well, you need to go outside to smoke your cigarette. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, why? What's the big deal? But it didn't take long.
Mm-hmm.
It was
hard to believe we actually allowed it in airplanes.
It was everywhere. It was everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah.
In college classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Your professors smoked in their offices while you met with them. I mean, it was just very common.
Yeah, that's right. That's one I'd forgotten earlier, but yeah,
So
many of us struggled with that one.
They have this compulsive behavior that ends up doing damage. What causes addiction? I mean, where does it come from?
It's a great question. It's pretty complex. There is what we know a strong genetic component, so it's handed down through families, but that's not a guarantee that you're going to get it or trigger it, if you will. There's a strong environmental factor with that.
What do you mean by environmental?
Well, nature versus nurture. If you are in a drinking environment, maybe you've been raised in an alcoholic home, seems like the normal way to celebrate or grieve or just live, you're more likely to pick that up. One of the interesting facts I think is that the age of first use can be determinative or can help eliminate or reduce whether that disease actually manifests in an individual. In other words, we've got children, their age of first use, they're starting to drink or use drugs at age 12.
Oh, my word.
And that's not
Before
really
their
very
brains are
new.
even
Oh my goodness,
before
yes.
their brains are even developed or set. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if that individual can delay, or their family can help them delay, or the community can help them delay that age of first use to perhaps 21, then there is a significantly less chance that they will become addicted down the line. That's the reason we have a drinking law of 21, mostly because these frontal cortex of our brain, the thinking and decision-making part, isn't fully developed till age 25 on average. And so, the addictive process where the pleasure center kind of overrides and hijacks the thinking, which again answers that question, how come they just can't stop?
Yeah, good
Right?
point. Good point.
Yeah,
It's a whole different part of the brain
It
that's
is.
that's acting and controlling things.
absolutely. And the interesting part, I think, is that it's a lot like an iceberg in that we as addicts or alcoholics can only report on about 10% of it because 90% of it lives, if you will, below sea level or below conscious level, subconscious.
Consciousness of the addict.
Correct.
So what are they not aware of?
Well, they're simply not aware of the neurotransmitters that are involved, the neural pathways that are involved, the compulsive nature. For them, and developing dysfunctional thought patterns, alcohol is the solution. It changes the way I feel.
Yes.
It always
yes.
works. And I go to that. Now we have family members or community that get in between the solution. They become kind of the problem in the addict's mind, right? To interrupt that cycle.
It is true, though, when you see reports in the newspaper about people behaving in crazy and harmful ways, it's often the result of frequently alcohol, maybe other drugs as well mixed in. But so they're making decisions that might seem sensible at the time to them, but happen to be against the law or harmful to others.
Or very unsensible to family members or the community at large.
Why is, I think when you and I talked earlier, Tom, you talked about alcohol being the most abused substance. I don't know if that's still true. We want to talk about the opioid addiction a little bit too, but why is it still true that alcohol is the most abused substance?
The damage that is caused by alcoholism, the disease of alcoholism or the misuse of alcohol, far exceeds the
Why is that?
damage of any other drug or, frankly, all the other drugs combined.
Wow.
Now, it is wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah, what is...
Because
talk
it
about
is socially acceptable. It's easy
Yes.
to obtain. 90% of the population can do it without significant adverse problems. 10% on average are addicted, can't do it, right? And it's everywhere, right? I mean, it's everywhere.
That's true. It's kind of, either you or one of you mentioned that it's the way to celebrate. It's the way, you know, and
Yeah.
that was true in our home. Something good happens,
Oh.
we have a drink, we break out the champagne,
Yeah.
that's,
Well, if you're going to be a good host in a social setting,
Well,
the
sure.
first question out of your mouth, can I take your coat? But can I get you a drink?
right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is very true. That's the sort of entree, the porthole into the party scene. You know,
Absolutely.
To the
And then,
moment.
you had mentioned too that it's even expected in some ways, like at college, fraternity hazing and some of the rites of passage in a way.
Indeed.
You turn 21, you get drunk. That's what I did in college.
I didn't quite wait till then.
But
thank you.
There you go.
Yeah.
I think, it was college for me too. That's when I started drinking.
The three of us, when we were chatting before the show started, referenced some common myths about addiction. Starting with, and I think you just said it, well, why can't they just quit? Or I can quit, why can't you? What are some of these myths, and why are they so?
Yeah.
Why are they such
Well,
barriers?
when you have 90% of the population, again in round numbers, that can do something, they find it difficult to look at somebody that does apparently the same thing, and can't make that change.
Limit.
Right.
Because it's omnipresent. If you can't do something that's omnipresent in the world, it's like saying you can't eat when everybody else gets to eat.
Well, that's an issue with food too. And
Yeah.
when people try to diet, they say, but food's everywhere and I can't not eat.
Right.
So it is somewhat the same.
Addiction, now this is Tom Gilbert's opinion, addiction is the disease, right? American Medical Association, Bar Association, World Health, they're all agreed addiction is a brain disease. It's not a moral issue, right? You're a bad person. It's not a matter of willpower, although we seem to think it might be. Right?
And is it,
What does that mean? We seem to think it might be.
Well,
what you mean
the
general
90%, yeah, the general population.
I can
you know,
stop
'cause-
at one.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
Right?
Yeah, I get that.
My wife used to bet me, I bet you just can't have one. Right? As we're going out to a social function, and my thought process was, who wants just one? Right? I'd rather have none than one. There's no reason. Because I, unlike some of the others, drink for the effect. I like the effect. It changes the way I feel. And it always worked. Right? And that can take you down the primrose path, if you will. My father said it one way, if you've got a button that works, keep pushing it. He meant it in a different context, but it seemed to apply here, right?
and then it's because it changes the way you think, you don't notice that it's not working.
Correct.
mean,
Or as well. I mean, it's characterized by tolerance, which means I need to take more to get the same effect. Right? And that's very subtle. I don't recognize that when I'm in active addiction. The question, I can quit, why can't you, is basically because my decision-making part of my brain, my frontal cortex, has been hijacked, if you will, and I no longer have control of that. It's, again, I think interesting to note that, pardon me, the earlier that we begin drinking and drugging, and however often, and however much, we actually have the ability to change the structure and the function of our brain.
So then if you stop, can we regain that brain function?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good, it is, and I would say yes, maybe.
Yeah, I know, you sound like it's a qualified yes.
Yes, the body's an amazing thing, and yes, there is some amazing healing that can happen to an addicted brain once the substances are stopped. There is a point in which of no return that you've caused enough damage that it doesn't come back. That's pretty scary. But I think what's more scary is kind of the thought from some of the younger folks that, for instance, marijuana, it's natural, it's it should be legal, it should be this, that, and the other thing. Get off my case, leave me alone. Sure, young man or young lady, continue to do what you're doing, but we've got research to say that you are significantly affecting your IQ in the future and changing the structure of your brain and the function. Now, if you want to take that chance, have at it, right? Oh, it's not addictive.
It won't
I can
happen
quit
to me.
anytime.
I can quit
Wow,
anytime,
there's a dysfunctional thought process. But 90% of the population can say that and be truthful. And the 10% who don't realize it say it because it's also characterized by a thought process called denial, right? Which for the addict sounds like either I don't have this disease, right? Or I can take care of it myself.
And then one other myth that I want to
Sure.
be sure we mention here, which was a new idea for me, was that that you can't help an alcoholic until they're at the bottom, that they have to go all the way down into some abyss, and then they're ready to get help.
That's really true, because many years ago I had a couple of friends struggling with this addiction, and both of them told stories, and that's why I was surprised when I came across that, of hitting the wall finally before they made their journey, began their journey out of the process. But this is new information.
Well, it's it's one of my pet peeves, right? Can't help an alcoholic till he hits rock bottom. So if addiction is, I believe it is, and I've got the research and the medical facilities to back it up, a chronic progressive, non-curable, potentially fatal disease, right? And we as families or loved ones stand on the sidelines and watch as we spiral down, losing our health, losing our relationships, losing our jobs, losing our freedom. What other chronic progressive
Right,
non-curable
yeah.
disease do we treat that way? I think you and I had this example. Oh, Anne Marie, I'm so sorry about your diagnosis of cancer.
Yeah.
When you get to stage 4 or hit rock bottom, I'll jump in with both feet.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, it is true that in addiction, how do I say, nobody comes to recovery because they see the light. Oh, what a beautiful day. Think I'll go to an AA meeting today, right? No. We come to recovery because we feel the heat.
Gosh, yeah.
We feel the pain. All pain is real. And having experienced a year and a half of public pain, I can speak from experience. But until the pain of staying the same begins to
sure.
outweigh the fear of making a change, there's really no likelihood of getting better. Now, what I hope that we can begin educating our community about is that rather than, hey, you can't help somebody until they hit rock bottom, change the paradigm, change the question. What will it take for that person to accept help?
I see.
We've got an open-ended question. We can begin exploring answers. Frequently, the process of intervention is the most effective answer. In other words, let's raise the bottom up so you don't have to spiral all the way to the bottom.
Talk a little bit about what intervention is. I've certainly heard about it. I deeply wish that process had been available when my mother was dealing with this issue. But talk about what constitutes an intervention and why is it effective?
Yeah, thank you. When in its simplest form, it's simply an interruption of the progression of the disease.
By?
Well, it can be anything or anybody.
Okay.
All right. But frequently, and families become experts at what does not work. I have to
Denial.
say, right?
Yeah.
We'll argue and we'll cajole and we'll bargain and we'll threaten and good luck, right? Tell me how that works. So what would work? Well, a process developed by Vernon Johnson in the 50s called the Johnson model, imagine that, anticipates 3 to 8 people that are or used to be important in that addict's life and surround him with love, dignity, respect, write an effective intervention letter, and confront him
Or her.
or her, good point, with what we've observed, how much we love you, and will you accept help? And that basic outline is 85 to 90% effective of cracking that defense, that denial,
Sure.
just a bit for the person to say, well, yeah, I guess, okay, right? And once you get to yes, that's a window of opportunity that isn't very big, doesn't stay open very long, and so action needs to be taken immediately. But that begins a process of healing. So that is an effective way to interrupt the downward progression of the disease using dignity and respect, especially for the addict, because, deep down inside, we're not happy about what we're doing, and I wish we could stop. For me, my personal situation was, I could quit. I quit hundreds of times.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I just couldn't stay quit. It was eventually my go-to place.
What helps people stay quit, though? I mean, I know AA meetings are certainly, I've known friends who, attend daily.
Certainly.
And for years.
Narcotics Anonymous also, and also
Overeaters.
overeaters, yeah.
Yeah. All based upon these that you've just mentioned, all based upon 12 steps, the original 12 steps,
Yep.
developed in the 30s by a down and out stockbroker and a proctologist in Ohio.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. And seems to be effective because it works in over 160 other mutual aid or self-help groups.
Yes.
But what is also happening currently, which is very exciting, is that there are many, many different pathways to recovery.
So what are some of the alternatives?
So there's
to 12
intervention,
step?
there's
Yeah.
AA, what else?
Right. Well, one of them would be smart recovery, and we're
What's
blessed.
that?
Well, it's kind of based on a cognitive behavioral therapy, but it is not therapist run. It is mutual aid self run.
Okay.
Right.
Really?
Smart recovery, yeah, showing great results. Doesn't work, on the 12-step framework. Women for Sobriety, Celebrate Recovery. Amazingly, at least in my mind, the majority of people that might meet criteria for addiction in college, let's say, as a young person, simply grows out of it. And that's not, that's a fact that is not widely known. But if you don't grow out of it and you have it, right, there are a lot of different ways. A lot of people use church,
Yeah.
because, it is a physical, mental, psychological, emotional, and spiritual malady, making it very complex
Sure.
and difficult to address.
And all those various helps that you've outlined involve support from others. Like this,
Correct.
you can't do this all by yourself. That'd be my guess. Or
And
it would
that's
be
my
harder.
experience, yes.
Harder to do it by
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah. I like to think of it this way. I can't fix this broken brain using this broken brain.
Right. Yes.
Or maybe Einstein said it a little better. You can't solve a problem using a brain that created it. Right?
Wow.
And if there's 90% of this problem in my brain that I cannot report on because it's subconscious, I'm going to need some help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to need a third party with some factual, non-judgmental feedback so that I can see. Where I made my most progress was recognizing that people could see things in me that I could not see in myself. And if they were communicated in an effective and non-judgmental way, I could begin to listen. And that was a key.
And
that
then-
opened the door.
And then eventually, do you discover that your life improves?
Yeah.
What's the
what's
payoff
incentive?
for going
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
for going through this very difficult process?
Again, an excellent question. Well, first of all, I think we need an appropriate definition of the problem. We've started along that line because the problem defines the solution, again, in my mind. So if the problem was drinking, just stopping drinking would be the solution. And I think we know people who have done nothing else but just stop drinking, and they're fairly miserable. You don't want to be around them.
Yeah.
They're not happy people, right? We've developed a name for that, the dry drunk syndrome. And we can, predict and tell, what kind of behaviors will be manifested.
I've seen the same thing with people who quit smoking or who go on a strenuous diet. You stop the addictive behavior, but it doesn't fix other things.
Right. So the goal has to be something more, right? The drugs and alcohol or the behaviors or whatever else are symptoms of an underlying problem. And we got to get down to the core of that. There's where we do our work, whether it's 12-step, whether it's counseling, whether it's treatment, whether it's church. We got to dig deep. We got to begin to know who we are.
Because of the complexity of that, all those different forces working on the addiction in the first place.
Sure.
Is,
Yeah.
is the core some kind of anxiety or depression or distress for which they're self-medicating, or are there other causes like
Yeah.
mental health?
Yeah,
or,
great question, and the answer is yes.
And yes.
And yes, and yes, and
Right.
yes.
Yes. There are situations where we self-medicate, maybe an underlying mental health issue. They're difficult to kind of tease out whether you've got a mental health issue or an addiction issue or both, right?
Yeah.
The thing about addiction is that it both masks and mimics the symptoms of other mental health issues.
Sure.
If we do have two standalone issues, depression perhaps and addiction, they both need to be treated. We used to think old school was treat the alcoholism first, treat the depression. We have better results if we just take them both on head on. And as addiction progresses, you can't help but show signs and symptoms of depression or anxiety or both.
Well, it's a depressant. I mean, alcohol
Yeah.
is a depressant. I mean, I
Yeah,
remember
and
the
if we're
first
gonna-
time I just thought of that. I mean, there's a high at first, and then there's just a real low. But
Exactly.
but it
and
must mean I need another beer.
well, yeah, yeah, and curious. I suffer from depression, so my answer is to take another depressant.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
I mean, we have a little time left, but I want to be sure that we address another major addiction in our community, which is the opioid crisis. We've talked a lot about alcoholism because it is so common, but you had talked earlier about the Northern Express article, recent.
Can we just
Sure, kind of put
hold
it up
that
here.
up
It was
there?
a couple of weeks ago. I love the headline, which says we don't have an opioid situation in Northern Michigan. We have a crisis. We do. We have a crisis.
So can you talk about what is it about opioids that has made them so dangerous
and insidious? I mean, it seems to be very sneaky, if I can use that term.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we, in the 70s, had a picture of what an opioid user would be, a heroin user. It was inner city, it was minority, needle hanging out in the gutter. And that ain't how it's going these days. It crosses all socioeconomic lines. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. Doesn't matter if you're male or female. Doesn't matter if you're Native or Black or Hispanic or white. I mean, it just crosses all lines.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's started with pills. I mean, this isn't necessarily needle, that image.
Right.
People have been prescribed these.
Yeah.
Yes, and it often starts with a legitimate prescription. Is that correct?
Indeed, indeed. Hard to believe, but for the entire world, it's a close statistic here, maybe not precise, but the United States consumes about 95% of all opioids produced in the world.
Wow.
What's wrong
Yeah.
with this picture?
Yeah.
So,
Early on,
so does that mean we have more pain?
no, I think
I
maybe
don't
we have
think
less
so.
tolerance
Yeah.
More
of
access?
pain.
Really?
More access,
and more
absolutely,
access
yeah.
to solve a pain issue.
Yeah. Well, and you know, we don't get as much training in medical school as we could, I think.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Wow.
It's for what I believe to be the #1 health crisis in America today, addiction in generally. Basically, they're getting 1 hour, a 1 hour lecture in 3 years.
that doesn't seem like enough.
No, for
Given
the
that
physicians.
this conversation just barely scratches the surface
Yeah.
of the depths of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
But in our community, a local funeral home told me that they buried one person a month because of opioid overdose. And just this Saturday, we had a charity hockey game in honor of a 23-year-old man that died of an overdose, and his family wanted to do something, so they put the Grizel's game together, I think, to honor him. He was a hockey player at age 23. died of an overdose this past, I think, October. And I believe they raised maybe over $15,000 in one
Wow,
night
That's wonderful.
to go to a local treatment center to help others, right? Access to treatment is abysmal. It's just abysmal. There's just, you know, from the 10% of folks that are addicted, only 1% can actually access effective treatment. That's ridiculous.
Does that mean treatment in a treatment facility
Not
or any kind of
necessarily.
treatment?
Yeah, not necessarily.
Okay.
A lot of different
Under
levels of
professional care.
correct. A lot of
Yes.
different levels of treatment. Residential, the highest,
Right.
right? Intensive outpatient, 3 times a week, 3 weeks, or 3 times a week, 3 hours a day, 8, 12 weeks in duration. Regular, if you will, outpatient, maybe once a week with a counselor, once a week with a group therapy session. What we are fortunate in Northern Michigan is that we've got over 250 recovery coaches trained.
Good.
Tell me, what is that?
What's a recovery coach?
Yeah.
It's a peer, so it's somebody who has solved their addiction issues, gotten 40 hours of training, and are qualified to help others find a right path for them.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's the first I've heard of that. That's really important
It really is.
information. Yeah.
yeah.
Do the
Is
same.
Is that the same as a sponsor?
No.
No, that's different.
A sponsor would be a 12-step recovery person, which is dedicated to help walk the path with you and help you get through some of the steps in 12-step recovery, right?
Yes.
Very specific role,
Okay.
but
A coach.
maybe 12 steps isn't your thing.
Yeah.
Maybe you can't do that.
Right.
Well, a coach would be knowledgeable about other pathways.
About all the different
Right.
options.
I see.
Yes.
And as we develop these pathways, as we publicize these pathways, the tide rises and more people can have access and get help.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very
So that part
informative.
is exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think so.
As we wrap this up, I did want to see if we could focus on some of the positive things. And in my own experience, I have to say that when I was growing up in this family dynamic of denial, things have changed enormously since then in terms of us. It's not quite as shameful, not quite as difficult to talk about this. Some of that still remains, and I don't doubt that families are wrapped in denial as mine was. But even just culturally, you and I were chatting about how we used to go out and have, the 2 martini lunches in the workplace. When I worked at the Record Eagle many years ago, the publisher would buy a pitcher of beer for the ad staff. That was the way it was. We'd go out after work and have drinks and drive home. Now, a lot of that has changed. I mean,
Yes.
that's not okay
Yeah.
the same way that smoking indoors is not okay. And so I do think culturally some things have changed that are positive. And certainly with the kind of programs you've developed and you're talking about, it seems really hopeful. They didn't exist when my mom needed help, except maybe AA, which would have not been something she would consider. So I see some positive steps that we've taken as a society.
We got a long way to go.
Yes.
But I agree, we have made some positive steps. If you look at some other examples of how we have changed culturally, the nicotine is a good example, the women's movement, the gay rights movement,
Yes.
racial equality movement, and I think the next frontier is addiction
That'd be
treatment,
great.
and
That'd be
recovery. And so if we can begin focusing on the or a solution, giving energy to the solution rather than the problem. I mean, frankly, we all know on some level what addiction's all about.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because it affects all of us. We've
That's
all
right.
got a story.
That's true.
We don't really know what recovery is all about. And when we begin to put a face and a voice to recovery, right? You know, you've lived through this time period where we couldn't say the words breast cancer,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Because of the shame, the guilt, the stigma that was associated, lack of information. But when a number of women stood up and said, I am not a victim, I'm a survivor, right?
Yeah.
And they told their story.
Good point.
And they put their face to it and their voice, took courage,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And they went on walks. Today we're driving down the road with pink cement mixers and hitting
Right,
balls
yeah.
out of parks with pink
That's right.
baseball bats, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And it now becomes okay to be in recovery or to be a survivor,
Yeah.
right?
And
Yeah.
even admirable
Exactly.
to have grappled with it and enter into it.
I think we're at the beginning of the same thing with addiction.
That would be wonderful.
Wouldn't
Oh,
it?
wow. Yeah.
Wouldn't
If
it?
we could embrace that as a
Yeah.
community and a country.
I use this example because it just kind of warms. The University of Michigan has 111,000 people on any given Saturday in the fall sitting in a big stadium, right?
Right.
Right? And the PA announcer says, all those that are in recovery, please stand up. Ooh. So out of 111,000, maybe you'll have 10,000. 10,000 people standing up.
Yeah.
How many of you are in recovery with that person or have
Oh.
taken steps and gotten healing or been affected? Now you're going to have 40,000. Half the group is going to stand up. And the other half are going to look and go, oh my God, you?
Yeah.
Well, you?
Yeah.
And once we attack that stigma that it's okay to be in recovery,
Yeah.
as employers
Yeah.
specifically, but as a community, we'll take huge strides
Yeah.
in solving the addiction problem.
And
That's the goal.
shifting the culture of
Absolutely.
of exposure.
Because remember, we're not bad people trying to get good.
Right.
That's a moral issue. We might do bad things, but deep down inside, we are sick
Sick.
people
We wanna
trying
get
to get well.
Yeah.
Hey, Tom, this has been so
Thank you.
substantive
Oh, you're so
and
very welcome.
illuminating.
so much.
It's been
What a
great.
pleasure to have
You're
you.
The
doing
pleasure
good
was
work.
mine. Thank you. I
All right.
appreciate it.
Yeah. Welcome back to Ideas Live. This is our debriefing on our show, our deep conversation with Tom Gilbert on the subject of addiction. And boy, what an eye-opener this one was. I don't
Yeah.
know about you, but I'm full of not just new information, but real insights into the idea of what addiction is all about and how we need to shift our perspectives. I mean, that was the big
Yes.
thing,
I
shifting
felt like-
perspectives.
For me, Tom helped me connect a lot of dots.
Yeah?
Like the cause effect and the whole notion that it changes our ability to think clearly,
Right.
to decide.
The brain chemistry.
And so no wonder we don't think there's a problem. And then, and then the whole notion that there are many paths to recovery.
That
It's
was refreshing because
yeah.
I think we're mostly, especially with alcoholism, we look mostly toward AA and those related programs. But he mentioned all kinds of other ways of entering into recovery, getting well. I mean, I think that's the big thing. We wouldn't say don't get well from the flu or bronchitis,
Right.
you know. And he's saying you get well from this. I think that's a really powerful concept that you enter into
And then
wellness.
the whole notion of how families and friends and communities need to be part of the recovery process.
Yeah.
It's not just an individual's problem. It's really a community problem.
He is so knowledgeable about this. I was also very interested in the intervention success rate, which was something
wasn't aware of
hadn't,
that.
yeah, hadn't thought a lot about. I think that's really important because I think we resist the idea of intervention.
Yes.
We don't want to be the people to go in and confront
It's difficult.
the whole avoidance of conflict that
That's true, and we didn't talk about that
Yeah.
part. But I think most of us are conflict adverse because we don't know how to do it.
Right. But he's saying there are steps. He outlined them. I thought that was very, very helpful. I just think this is especially now with the opioid crisis, this is a really important topic. I'm so grateful that he was here.
And we should mention that on our website we'll include
Yes.
a bunch of resources, including Tom's venture of Touchstone Intervention and some other national organizations that
That's right.
provide support for
And
recovery.
as director of Touchstone, he's in touch with this.
Yeah, for sure.
So
Wow.
that's our show.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for being with us.